I was shooting some marketing material for a local college, and because this is people in groups, there's a really great opportunity for some design here. In a previous vid, I talked about the golden section in a 35mm full frame and why that's relevant. But here I'm going to go back to something a little more basic, and that's the rule of thirds. And you can make that with just the armature of the rectangle on any rectangle. I want to expand on it though and show you a different way to see it, and that's with the rectangle's inner squares. You can call it the rebated square. It's classical design, and because we're using a 1.5, the primary division is going to be on the armature or thirds, but not using their diagonals. You're using the diagonals of both squares and the grid they create. It's a little different, and it was always one of my favorite techniques as a kid. I used it all the time, and I still do, because I'm working in a 35mm full frame that is a square and a half. You can get really complex with any grid. I'm going to try to keep things as simple as possible here, and because this is photography and not painting, things are not going to be exact. So you want to get things near that zone or in the zone, and the whole goal here is to play with the squares diagonals and not the rectangles. You can see how they're a little bit different from the diagonals of the rectangle. A little more interesting, something unusual. And when I'm doing this, I'm not trying to be creative. I'm just trying to be efficient. What I want to do is fill the 1.5 space with useful content. I don't want any waste, and I want every major division to relate to the whole space, geometrically, or in the case of the golden section, mathematically. And if the goal of design is efficiency through symmetrical unity, then there's always a way to expand it. So I'm going to include one more technique in this clip, and that's the circle. And it's great when it fits in the lines of this geometry, and sometimes it does, but that's rare. This is either going to be super obvious or not at all, depending on your level of experience with design, but how do you create balance when a figure who's basically in the lower thirds is looking off the page of a vertical? With an old classical technique of putting the eyeline on the grid, and it's with design elements that reinforce direction, preventing the viewer's eye from flying off the page. For example, the small circle is within the big circle but off-centered, and there's a lot of direction in the high contrast point coming off her arm that's on the grid that pushes you back in the direction of her face. This way you can rotate the viewer's eyes around the focal point that you determine, which in this case is the subject. Once again, big circle, obvious, not obvious. Major division right on the square. Angles of the wall are on the square, not on the armature, with one lucky hit. Groups of people doing things in small spaces almost make dynamic design too easy. There's so many different things you can play with, like opposing diagonals. Of course, the one on the right would be so much better if there was more elements to it, but photography, not painting. Repeating diagonals, and here there's a host of them, and you can really break them down in detail. And this is clearly more of an ellipse in the center than it is a circle, but there is circles here. You just have to make them bigger, and you can define these really large sweeps that exceed the notional space of the image. And by now you should be getting a sense of how the diagonals of the inner squares work and what their relationships are to the whole. So here's one more example of a circle and the different ways that you can interpret it within this shape. Some, I think you could argue this time, are not so obvious, but still work. And this one I'm going to break down in a little bit more detail. And now there's a little bit too much clutter here if you don't have this kind of pattern recognition, so I'm going to clean it up a little bit and just show you the last divisions. But for the most part, I want to keep all these simple and focus on basic elements. It's hard enough for people to understand that in the ancient world, we had all this ability and all this skill that took not years, but decades to achieve, to interpret the world in a way we thought was accurate in its complexity, in its depth, before science, like a visual theory of everything.